Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Kasia, for that introduction. And as Kasia said in that introduction, my main focus is assessment. And today we're looking at how assessment works in terms of making progress in language acquisition, for want of a better word. So we're looking at, as Kasia mentioned there, motivation. Because it's talking about assessment, we're looking at measurement and also achievement. Kasia's kindly agreed to run my slides because we couldn't get the slideshow to work exactly as we wanted to. So Kasia, if you go to the next slide, please, that would be great. Thank you. So, whatever you call this, an agenda or a running order, these are the kind of things that I'd like to talk about today. And there's some interaction in the presentation, so I will be asking for you to pop things in, answers to questions in. So if you can pop those in the chat, I think most people know how to use the chat. So, and also there should be time for questions at the end. And again, people can pop those in the chat and or, think about them as you go along, or indeed pop them in the chat as things come to mind. So we're going to talk about progress in language attainment. So how we measure that. An interesting one that people may have thought about themselves, but how long does it take to learn a language is a question that sometimes we're asked, and it's a difficult question to answer, but we'll try and get some way along that line. The psychology of learning, and obviously I don't have, we have 40 minutes here or 50 minutes. We're not going to talk about this in great depth or detail, and many of you on the call may well have better ideas about the psychology of learning than I do. But we'll touch on a few things in relation to how people learn languages, and in particular looking at motivation. Then, well, because I'm an assessment specialist, as I said, well, how can assessment, what role can assessment play in this area? And what about the teacher? This is something that comes up, we're talking about new technology, we're talking about changes to the way we work. So how does the role of the teacher change in looking at measuring and giving feedback to test takers on their progress? And then, as I say, hopefully time for questions at the end. Okay, the next slide, please, Kasia. So, we can go to a dictionary. I mean, just we quoted here the Longman Dictionary of Contemporary English because it just happens to be a Pearson publication. But, what do we mean when we say progress? How do we define progress? And, if we take the dictionary definition, which we often can, the definition of progress is getting better at doing something. So if we're thinking about language, well, what does the doing something mean in terms of language? So we can look at, and this is one distinction made primarily by a famous linguist whose name has just escaped me, but the difference between knowledge of the language. So this is one element. So Henry Widdowson, sorry, apologies. So Henry Widdowson made this distinction between knowledge of the language, so vocabulary rules, grammar rules. And one thing I would add to this, and I added to it in another presentation, is phonological rules. We sometimes think of languages as just the written word, but when we're talking about knowledge of the language, then phonological rules are just as important, in fact, probably more important than some of the other rule-based elements of language. So there's the knowledge, which is to many people's understanding of this innate, it's in your brain. But then there's the ability to use the language. So this kind of functional use of language. So even though I know the word or I know the phrase, am I able to use it appropriately in day-to-day conversation, for example? So we often divide up language into knowledge and use. So what does this mean in terms of how we measure progress. So we've got those two elements. So we've got the elements of the language knowledge itself, which is in the brain, and then we've got this use of language. So those are two key elements. And if we're thinking about the language ability and the concept of language proficiency, then there are two key elements to that. So one of it is how much do you know? So of all those language, those language elements, what's your knowledge of that? And I think in very simplistic terms, you could look at vocabulary, how many words do you know? But then there's a quality element. So you may have a lot of knowledge, but how well can you use that knowledge? So this quantity and quality, it relates both to knowledge and to use. So how much do you know, and how well can you actually use what you know in your communication, for example? How well can you communicate? How effective are you in your communication? So these are two elements that when we talk about measuring language proficiency, then we're measuring both how much people know and also how well they can use what they know. So I'll try to explain this in simple terms, because this isn't a simple concept, but take, for example, the word day. Okay, now day is a very standard word, and what I've done when I've done teacher training before is, you basically put up a simple word like day, and you say to participants in the training, well, okay, if somebody needs to know the word day, what do they need to know? What elements of the word is it important to know? So, Kash, if we go to the next slide, you can see, for example, if we start at the top, okay, so you need to know kind of, what part of speech is it? Is it a noun? Is it a verb? Is it an adjective? You need to know how to pronounce that word. Now, of course, pronouncing day is not particularly difficult. It's a consonant sound followed by a vowel sound. But obviously there are words, there are other words in English for which pronunciation is more difficult. And if we start talking about multisyllable words, then again, stress timing and other elements. So whenever to know a word is more than just being able to look at D-A-Y and think, oh, day, okay, I know day, today. There's more to it than that. You have to know the pronunciation, you have to know the part of speech and the meaning. Now, as many of you will know, words tend to have multiple meanings. Today, thank you. So if you go, and I'm not going to show it now, but if for example, we went to the Longman Dictionary and looked up day and looked up the number of meanings that day has. So if you look up the Longman Dictionary, have a guess how many meanings are listed for the word day in the Longman English Dictionary. Just pop it in the chat. So a lot, yes, thank you. Actually, there are 7 main meanings of day. But then if you extend it with all the idiomatic use, it goes up to 27, I think. Yes, it goes, no, if you, with all the idiomatic use, it goes up to 23. But I'll just go through the 7. So it's 24 hours. There you go. That's the meaning of the word day. Not night. That's another meaning of day. When you're awake is another meaning of day. Time at work is another meaning of it. In the past, I knew him pretty well from his days as a DJ is an example there. And also, they can also mean now. I don't do much exercise these days. And just to give credit to other dictionary makers, if you go to the Cambridge Dictionary, the Cambridge English Dictionary, they also give, for example, common European framework levels for those different meanings. And if you start counting idiomatic use and different phrases, then the list goes on about, as you can imagine, a simple word like day is used in many, many different everyday phrases. So that, and then of course you've got usage. It was quite funny. I was in a coffee shop the other day, and of course, as I bought my coffee, the person serving said to me, "Oh, have a nice day." And I thought, "Oh, that's interesting. You know, what do I say? You know, how do I, you know, because, you know, it's, you know, as a phrase, have a nice day is phatic, you know, it's almost meaningless. They're not really telling me to have a nice day. So similarly, going back, when somebody says to you, have a nice day, you come back with something equally phatic, something equally meaningless, like, oh, you too. Okay, thanks. But, you know, again, usage, how you use that particular word is something that a student needs to know. So this is, you know, quantity and quality. It's, you know, I'm exemplifying it using a simple thing like a word, but you can imagine how much more complex it is when you're thinking about more complex structures and when you're thinking about functional language. It's much more complex in terms of what is the quantity and the quality. Okay, if we move on, so, you know, you think about day, move on, Kasia, if you can, to the next slide. And, you know, I mean, we could do the same with night. We can go on, we can keep doing this forever, but I just, if you go to the next slide, Kasia. With night, you know, you think, you know, well, night, of course, means the opposite of day. Night time, or what does that mean? You know, the number of different meanings, nightmare, night and day, nighty night. This is a good one. I don't know if people know this one. You know, it means good. It's like a colloquial form of good night, nighty night. Nighty, something you wear at night. Something of the night, you know, means something sinister, something dark, because of course night is associated with dark things and with things that, you know, the things that go bang in the night. And then of course there are, you know, as in English, you know, let's nice little spoilers, words that have exactly the same sound, you know, the synonyms and homonyms, you know, like night, you know, but night, obviously, knight in shining armor. So knowledge of language is a very complex area. And so measuring that and measuring progress in language is also very complex. So how do we measure? How do we start to measure progress? Well, the basic tools of measuring progress are basically frameworks which describe language. So now, in the past, those frameworks have been things like grammars. You know, a grammar would describe the grammar of the language, but of course that's incomplete in terms of describing. Not that only describes the knowledge, not the ability to use. So the frameworks that we find are used now to measure progress are ones which are not just about knowledge, but about use. So a good example is the Common European Framework of reference. And for those people who are familiar with the Common European Framework, you will know that language is described in terms of what people can do in the language. So the structural elements, the grammar, the vocabulary, the phonological rules, are considered to be the kind of bedrock and the basis of which a person, you know, the resources that a person has at their disposal, at their mental disposal, in order to communicate. But the key element is what they can actually do with the language, and can they actually ask for a cup of coffee or cup of tea? You know, what, you know, can they buy something? Can they transact? But then can they transact in a way, if, for example, in a seminar, you know, can actively participate in a seminar in English? These are the types of descriptions that you'll find in the Common European Framework. And what Pearson have developed, and I may go into this in more detail later if we have time, but what Pearson have developed is something called the Global Scale of English. And Kasia, if you just click on your button, there will appear this the symbol there, the global scale of English. Now, the global scale of English is two things. One is a set of descriptors based on the Common European Framework. So using Common European Framework descriptors, but adding to it so that we have a greater level of descriptiveness of competence. So we have more and more descriptors which tell you what a language, what a person can do at different levels. And also a scale. So it gives you an idea about where somebody is along their language proficiency journey. Now, of course, the Common European Framework does that as well. Kash, if you go on to the next slide, please. So let's look at how these things interact. Okay, so this is the Common European Framework. The levels are from A1 to C2. You can also define a level that, in fact, it has been defined in the new version of the Common European Framework, the tourist level below A1. So you can find on this continuum of language learning, you know, the tourist level is when they start learning, and C2 is when we're getting people basically who have mastered the second language that they're learning, second or third or fourth, but anyway, mastered that language, because we're talking about language learning. And you know, the Common European Framework is useful in that it has split up these this language proficiency continuum into a number of different levels. And if you read the Common European Framework, you can actually have any number of levels in theory, and the Common European Framework accepts that. However, what is common currency are the 6 levels, which is A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2, and also in other contexts, in some other contexts, another 3 levels, A2 plus, B1 plus, and B2 plus. And if you look at the diagram here, you can kind of see why those plus levels exist, because you can see that A2, for example, is twice the size of A1. A2, B1, and B2 of similar lengths. So people have put in plus levels there to kind of divide up the Common European Framework a bit more. Now, those little blue dots, they represent students, because we've got students and learners, may not be students, just learners who are on that continuum. And also the little arrows refer to the descriptors. So at these different levels, we can describe what somebody can do. So the person number 1 who's just beginning A2, we can describe what they can do at that level using descriptors that are based around the beginning of A2. Now, person number 2 is also at A2, but very close to B1. So the same descriptors won't apply. And you can see there are other descriptors. There are other descriptors which are more appropriate for that particular test taker, that particular student. And, you know, one of the weaknesses of the Common European Framework is that both student 1 and student 2 are at A2, but in fact, student 2 is practically the same as student 3, who is at the bottom of B1 in terms of their levels of ability and in terms of the description of their language ability. So whilst the Common European Framework is extremely useful, especially in terms of giving us descriptors of what people can do at those particular levels, it's less useful in saying that, you know, where somebody is in relation to another person, for example. So if you move on the slide, I mean, there's Kashi, it just circles the 2 and 3, which we don't really need. That's what we're talking about. So we can move on. Yeah, that's fine. Just move on to the next slide. And one more. Yeah, that's it. So this is the purpose of the global scale of English, and this is the scale, not the descriptors, is to have a scale. And here you can see the scale is between 10 and 90. So instead of having 6 levels or 9 levels, if you want to put in the plus levels, so the A2 plus, B1 plus, B2 plus, instead of that, you have a scale, a numerical scale between 10 and 90. And so when you're positioning or saying, well, well, how good is your language? Where are you in terms of your language proficiency? Rather than telling people that they're a B2 or that they're a B1, you can tell them where they are actually within B1. So for example, like we had the A2 student at the top of A2, well, they may well be 42 on the global scale. The student who was the just starting A2, they may be 31. Okay, so there'll be a 10-point difference between them. Whereas the student who's just starting B1, they might be 44. So the difference between the A2 student and the B1 student might just be 2 points. And as we'll see from a statistical perspective, 2 points is relatively, well, it's subject to measurement error. You don't really know, even if it's 1 or 2 points on a scale like the global scale of English, you're saying that people are pretty similar in terms of their language proficiency. Oh, the connection is awful. Somebody said, are people finding the same, or is that just that particular person's connection? Okay, I'll move down a bit. Some people saying there. Mine works well. Okay. So maybe it's that person. So sorry about that. If you maybe try to get onto a different machine or something. Yep. Okay. Most people are okay. Great. Thanks. Okay. This is a question for you, and please, use the chat for this. So we're talking about common European framework levels, and we're talking about moving from B1. So by B1, I mean the beginning of B1 to B2. So if you think back to my diagram a couple of minutes ago, if somebody's now starting out into B1, how many hours will it take them? Thank you very much. Yes, how many hours will it take them to get to the bottom of B2? Great. Some people being very optimistic here. Other people being a bit pessimistic, about 1,000 hours. And of course, the answer that comes in there for, it looks like Jenilyn, it depends, which I like. It's a nice answer. It depends. And indeed, that is the answer. It depends. But we can be a little bit more accurate in terms of what it is. And if we look at the next slide, Kasia, this gives us an idea about how long it takes to move up a level. Okay. There's a paper. So if you go on to, again, there's a website and there's a toolkit on the GSE website. So if you look at pearsonenglish.com GSE, then so this is not just me speaking. This is based on research, and it's research that we published in terms of how long it takes people to learn a language. And what we did was we took a lot of research that had been done before. A lot of this is from the US, but we tried to pull that together and look at what it was telling us about the time taken. Now you can see here 2 snails in the picture, okay? And this goes back to the comment that Jenilyn made, that it depends, because obviously learners are in different situations and learners are in different contexts. So, for example, if you've got a large proportion of lessons in your school in the foreign language, let's say English, but in that foreign language, if you've got access to a lot of media, if your friends, for example, are very predisposed to using English or learning English, so if you're in a certain context, then you will learn. If you're European based and you've got a European language, you'll again tend to learn English, for example, or other languages obviously as well, If your language has a lot of cognates, so for example, if it's an Italian person learning Spanish, for example, then you will learn at a faster rate. So in ideal conditions, then we would say that to go from the bottom of B1 to the bottom of B2 is about 380 hours. So those people who said 400, yes, that's about right. It's about 400 hours in ideal conditions, if you've got very well motivated learner in good learning conditions. However, if, for example, you're only learning English once or twice a week, if, for example, you don't have friends who are interested in language, if you don't have access to much resources, if you speak in your mother tongue for most of the your function, your daily life, then it can take a lot longer. And so, for example, we estimate that it would take over 1,000 hours. So for those people who said D, in fact, yes, you're right. In certain contexts, it can take over 1,000 hours to get 1,000 hours of tuition, of learning, for you to get from the beginning of B1 to B2. Now, as we said, that the B level, the B1 level, the B2 level, they're wider than other levels. So, for example, to move from the bottom of A1 to the bottom of A2 is actually much quicker. That could be 100 hours if you're a well-motivated learner in a good learning context. But again, much slower if you don't have the resources and you don't have the ability to activate your language on a regular basis. So if people are interested, there is that paper there, but it does depend on the context, and also, as many of you will say to me, I'm sure, it depends on the person, because it's not just about learning opportunity based on your interests. Absolutely, and that's very, very true. And we'll talk about that in a second. And again, so the point as well of having a scale like the global scale of English is that it's not just about moving from the bottom of B1 to the top to the bottom of B2. You can say to students, well, that's moving from 43 to 59. So they're going to go 43, 46, 48, 55, 59. So, if you have this scale, this granular scale, then you can say to people, oh, you're making progress. I mean, people can spend like 400 hours in B1 and they're still in B1. So the point of having this granular scale is you can say, oh, right, you've done 70 hours of study. Now you're still B1, but you're not 43, you're 46. You're not 43, you're 47. So having that scale and having those numbers is helpful if you're trying to show people that they've made progress. Of course, one of the difficulties is if they take a test and the test is giving them a score and the score goes down. I mean, they haven't, students have not made the opposite of progress. They haven't regressed as such. It's just that tests can only, are only sensitive to a certain degree. So you've got to accept that, over a short period of time, a short course, a term at school, students may not make a massive amount of progress in terms of their actual language ability. Now, there might be differences in their confidence. There may be differences in certain aspects of their language ability. That they can, at the beginning of the course, they couldn't really say anything, but now they can speak a little bit. But when you talk about measuring language and measuring language ability, that quantity and quality, then, if you're measuring that with an accurate measurement tool, it still has that level of it's still probabilistic. It's still telling you the likely level that you are at after taking that test. Okay, let's move on a little bit. So I'm talking a lot about progress and how long it takes, and also a little bit about what we mean by progress. But what about learning, the psychology of learning? So, and how does this fit into progress? And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of people on this call, teachers or have learnt languages themselves, and they know that learning a language is not an easy thing. And there's a book, people might want to look it up later on You can buy it on Amazon. But anyway, there's an author called Angela Duckworth, and she's written a book called Grit: Perseverance, Resilience, and Passion for Long-Term Goals. And basically, what Pamela's saying is that, you know, to be successful, and this isn't just about languages, this is about any kind of learning. You know, if you want to be successful in learning, you have to persevere, you have to be resilient, you know, you have to deal, you know, so that you have to have a passion. And this is why somebody in the chat said, you know, based on your interest too, you know, effective language learning is as much about the individual as it is about the class, and it is about the you know, the context of learning and the opportunities of learning. Of course, all those things help, and we know that in certain countries. You take, for example, the Dutch. You know, in general, in Holland and in the Netherlands, they've got a higher level of proficiency because in that context, a lot of people watch English language films and entertainment and documentaries in English. And so people from an early age are exposed to a lot of English. Less so in some other countries. But from a language learning perspective, it's the individual who has to have these characteristics. So they have to be thorough, vigilant, conscientious, a word which is often used in language learning. And also they need courage. And this isn't about, you know, obviously not about fighting, but this is about, you know, facing adversity, you know, setbacks in your learning, being able to deal with times when you couldn't communicate or times when you had difficulty in getting your goal. So these are characteristics which, as I say, this Angela Duckworth draws out as being critical to learning, and very much based around the individual, which is an interesting perspective. And she identifies these things that help with supporting perseverance, resilience, and passion. So goal setting, you know, where do I want to be? What do I need to learn? By when? What are my goals in this language learning, specifically about the language, or, you know, in terms of my ability? Developing learning strategies. So how can I, you know, what can I do to enable me to you know, to be thorough, to be careful, vigilant? What strategies can I have? And also this idea of the growth mindset. I'm sure people have come across this, you know, positive, sure. Yeah, I think the slides, somebody's put, will possibly share the slides. Akasha can deal with that at the end, but yeah, thanks. So the growth mindset, so a positive attitude towards learning, and also this comes back to the teacher, that the teacher, or the, you know, if you're in that learning context, is also motivating, helping the students by being positive about the outcomes of their learning rather than being negative about them. I'm not going to go into growth mindset in detail here, but people can look that up. It's it's basically a positive orientation to learning, which is really important in language learning. And of course, feedback is critical to language learning, and shown by research that if you give immediate feedback, the more immediate feedback you can give, the closer a speech act or some kind of language performance. If a teacher is giving feedback on that, the quicker the teacher gives the feedback, the more impact it has in terms of learning. So these are important elements in terms of the psychology of learning, and, you know, giving people that context where they can learn most effectively. Kasia, next slide, please. Thank you. And, you know, so we can kind of make a distinction between mastery goals. So this is where we're looking at how much progress we're making as an individual, our own improvements. Okay, so you know, this is increased interest and achievement, and especially doing more complex tasks. And this is, you know, how you associate with language. You know, the more competent you become, then the more complex things you can do with language. Positive emotions and less anxiety. This idea of having some confidence in yourself, and the growth mindset. And as we said before, you know, more effective study strategies. So people who are looking to master things are generally, they've got effective ways of studying and effective ways of retaining information that they need. And again, this could be languages, it could be something else. Performance goals are less useful. So performance goals are when you compare yourself with others. So, you know, you could sometimes that could be memorization or repetitive tasks that can be useful. And you know, and certainly for students who lack confidence, these kind of strategies can actually help them to stay focused, as it says there. But performance goals also are associated with more negative emotions, such as anxiety, and also with less effective study strategies. So it's better if you can, you look to master the language that you're learning, and using those positive energies and successful study strategies that will help you achieve those long-term goals. No worries, we're coming on to, somebody says a bit late, but we're coming on to some another area here. So Kasia, if you move on a little bit. So, I mean, one of the things I think we talk about, particularly in the psychology of learning, and something that's of interest, I think, for language teachers and learners, is motivation. And certainly when I was doing my training courses, we had sessions on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So, you know, what do you think is most powerful? Intrinsic motivation, so that's like the internal desire, your internal need to learn something, or to, you know, so it's something to do with your self-belief, your ego. Or extrinsic motivation. This is a need to learn a language from an external perspective. You know, you need it because you need this job. You know, you need it because oh well, I have to learn English, otherwise I can't get into university. You know, you can't say both. Which do you think is more powerful? One is more powerful than the other. There is an answer to this question. So both is not, no, sorry, you're wrong. Both is wrong. So is it your internal desire, or is it somebody telling you? And think about your own language learning. You know, do you think you were a successful language learner because you wanted to learn, or because you were told you had to? Okay, thank you. A lot of feedback there, and if the next slide, there's a little bit to read on the next slide. So, Kasia, so. Yes, and it's interesting to see whether that's true or not about younger learners and older learners. It's a good point. I don't know. I don't know the answer. I tend to think possibly not, but yeah, it's a fair point. So indeed, intrinsic motivation, it's by studies, the studies that have been done, has shown to be the one that, generally speaking, gives you the most positive outcomes. And so, you know, from a teaching point of view, an educational point of view, then, you know, I think the third point in this bullet list is the important one, you know, personalization. You know, and I think if you've been listening to my talk today, you know, one of the kind of messages I hope that comes through is, you know, that, and again, it's, I'm sure you on reflection may feel the same, may not, but you may feel the same, that, you know, a lot of learning is personal. A lot of learning, successful language learners do it, you know, using the context that they're in, but through their own motivations and through their own desires and their you know, their own drive. So personalization is really important from a teaching perspective, in encouraging this, you know, the individual to look at their own motives, relevance, and that a lot of people have talked about this. You know, even when you've got school kids, you know, people who may not see the immediate use of language, you know, you try to make it relevant to them, try to make them understand how the benefits of this for them personally in the future. Engagement, obviously, trying to make things interesting. I think many teachers do that. And also, as I said, the real importance of feedback, going back to somebody saying, right, okay, and the positive mindset. So it's not correcting errors. Okay, this is where it all falls down. Teachers think that their function is to correct people's errors. The teacher's function is not to correct errors. The teacher's function is to encourage and to give feedback and to give a positive mindset so that students can see the value in what they're learning and not have that negative impact of, oh, I failed, oh, I didn't do that, I didn't get there. When we're talking about the global scale of English, we don't talk about, lower levels and upper levels. We don't talk about, oh, you're only A1, you're only, it's language is just a continuum. You can start at A1 and you can get to B2. It's fine. But, that will take grit. It'll take passion, motivation, and it'll take, individual enthusiasm to get there. Great, good point there again from Jillian. Yes. And no problem being late. Okay, now I want to just talk a little bit about assessment. And these are, slightly rhetorical questions in a way, but things that I think, we have to think about the relevance of assessment. So is assessment fit for purpose? And by that, I mean, so we've talked about making progress. We talked about what that means. We talked about a scale. We've talked about learning objectives and how, descriptors and how they tell you about language. Can, language assessment help in any of this? Can it support learning? Can it help give, for example, feedback? Can it help personalization? Can it help motivation? Now, it should be able to, but let's think, so how do people learn languages and what are their motivations? So this is a critical thing for assessment. And as people have been pointing out in the chat, if it's extrinsic and, it's all about your job, it's all about getting somewhere in life, are there tests which can help you? Are there tests which can show you where you are and where you want to get to? Where is learning most effective? In the classroom or in real life situations? I talked earlier about the Dutch context where a lot of people are using language in real life situations, watching the movies. It's real life, even though of course the movies are not real. Well, not real life, but reflections of life. But a lot of us learn language in the classroom. Okay, so if we are learning in the classroom, then it needs to be effective. You can't just say to somebody, oh, go and watch some movies. That's, it might be helpful, but is it going to be the be all and end all? Not, perhaps not, so even if real life situations help you with the ability to use language, for example, there's still a role in the classroom for giving knowledge, for example, knowledge about the language, for developing vocabulary, developing reading skills, and where the teacher can guide the student, with feedback and with a positive learning environment. And feedback is critical, as I said, and that feedback is part of formative assessment, formative feedback. So trying to give people support if there's areas of language that they have learned or tried to learn, and they haven't really achieved that area to the teacher's knowledge, then how can assessment help to give that formative feedback? Oh, you need to work on this. You need to work on this area. And the whole, and I don't know what proportion I could have asked at the beginning. I assume many of you are teachers and are very concerned about, well, what is the role of the teacher in the classroom, or what's the role of the teacher, in fostering, these good learning, a good learning environment, and a positive attitude and intrinsic motivation from the students that we're dealing with. And I'm sure people have got great stories. I remember when, from my teaching time teaching, we always had stories of students, students who come in at a very, at A1 and that were leaving, with very high level language proficiency. So, there are lots of positive stories coming out of classrooms as well as ones perhaps less so. And some good points being made in the chat for those who are monitoring that. So here we go, teacher or tester? It's of course a rhetorical question on my part. This is a teacher. However, we all know that teachers are asked quite often to run tests. I remember when I started teaching, that was the first job I was given. Oh, can you write a test for the class, please? English test, end of year English test. And I had no idea what to do. What was it, So, oh, take this workbook and take some questions out of the workbook. So, yeah, I agree with the point, MC's point there. Teachers usually have many roles in the classroom. That's absolutely right. And one of those roles is to foster that learning environment. This teacher is not really working in the classroom here at the moment. They're just grading some papers. So not really, the best use of their time. And I think most teachers would agree with that. But of course, teachers need to know about their students. They need to know what they can do and what they can't do. They've got to be able to understand how their individual students' learning is taking place. Otherwise, they can't help them. They can't support them. So, traditionally, teachers have done that by marking the work of the students. So then they know in detail what issues and problems the class has as a whole, and what issues that individual student has. But with technology, and this is where the technology element comes in on this talk. With technology, we can help a bit more. So if we move, Kasia, to the next slide. So feedback, we've always given feedback in terms of, if you take a test and then, there'll be a grade. I mean, the limit, the pass, fail, merit or whatever is the worst kind of feedback, but at least that's feedback. So test providers have tried to give more feedback. So to give, the average score is this, your CFR level is this, your listening score is somewhere here, your reading score is somewhere here, and comments on that. But a lot of this is fairly standard stuff. It's not really about the individual themselves. It's not about that test taker, the student who's taking a test. It's stuff which is just built out of a lot of it's taken from the Common European Framework. And these descriptors can follow complex spoken languages related to daily life is just a phrase taken out of the Common European Framework. It doesn't actually have any relevance for that particular student who took this test. Next slide, please. But if you link, as we do, your assessment criteria with your learning criteria, you can give more detailed information. So here, for example, using technology, this is it says a Pearson English level test. So this is just a placement test. But the placement test, is giving the teacher the information they need, seeing how the students group into different levels, and therefore makes it much easier to see where the students are and how they can be placed into different courses. Okay, so using data can help us in placing students into courses which are relevant for their level. Next slide, please, Kasia. And we can give a much more detailed score report on what the student can actually do. Now we've got this description of overall language proficiency, which is pulled from various sources from the GSE. We've got the Common European Framework. We've got the scale, the global scale of English. So we can give more detailed information and a much more granular reflection of where that person's ability is according to skills. And also we can, compare to a previous score. So we can, it says their comparison to previous scores. So we can see whether or not the person has improved, whether they've made progress. So by measuring them on this granular scale, we can see whether progress has been made for that individual or not. And these reports can be produced, it says there, in just a few minutes. You can get these reports back in the score report software. And Kasia, one more slide. And then more importantly, because we link learning and assessment together through the global scale of English, through the descriptors that we have, and we're linking the learning material with the test material, we can give feedback to that student saying in a positive manner, right, this is where you are now. These are the things you can do. These are the objectives you can set yourself, and these are the things you can do in order to improve your learning, to make more progress. So this is where you are now, and to make more progress, these are the things that can help you, and it can reference the areas of learning that you should do, and also you can reference particular textbooks that you can use. Onto I think what is the penultimate slide. Sorry, there's actually, yes, it is the penultimate slide. And then, teachers can get that information if they wish at a group level as well. So for teachers, it's a tool where, yes, the student can see where they're at, but then the teacher can see where the class is at, and if they've made themselves, the class as a whole has made progress. And just onto the last couple of slides, very similarly, when this is actually something called a readiness test. It's a readiness test for Pearson English International Certificate, and this is where the test taker is taking a test to show their level, to get a B2 or to get a B1, if that is a B1, isn't it? B1 level. Then they can take the readiness test, which gives them a good idea about what their chances are of passing. You can see the traffic lights there, green, amber, and red. But it can also say to them, well, this is learning material that you can recommend them learning material. So if their course that they're doing is linked to a particular textbook, then it will identify within that textbook the areas that they could work on that will move their ambers up to green, and hopefully move their red up to amber. I think this is one more slide there, Kasia. And there, as I say, so what the report gives you is very detailed feedback and specific exercises that you can do in your course book that will actually work on the areas that the testing has found are areas of weakness for you. So, it is possible to use assessment and technology to bring into the classroom a much more detailed analysis and much more detailed support and feedback that allows personalization of learning, allows, focuses on that intrinsic motivation that the students need so that they can make significant progress in their language learning. Great. Well, there's a question already in the chat, so I will move on. I've got 5 minutes. So, and if anybody else got other questions in the chat, please pop them in. But I'll answer this question. So the question is, it just moved. Excuse me. I'll just find it again. Some students seem to be too optimistic about their language competencies. Without discouraging a student, how can a teacher motivate one to seek for higher proficiency? And I think that's a good point, actually. And I don't think we should be negative about a particular test taker, a student's language competence. But I think certainly taking a test, having one's language proficiency measured is helpful. If they think they're B2 and they take a B1 test and they do that and they pass that, then that's great. But I agree with you. It's sometimes a difficult line to cross. I mean, if you give them a B2 test and they fail, then you're not really doing a good job, are you? So I agree with you. It's a difficult balancing act. And maybe it's worth pointing out to them in a nice way some areas of language that might be helpful for them. You might want to you could focus on more on your speaking, and can you depending on what their strengths and weaknesses are. But yeah, I agree, it's a difficult line if there's an overconfidence of the student. Okay, I think, Kasia, we'll leave it at that. There's a lot of comments in there thanking me. So if you want to just round up, and that's great. But thank you for your attention.